Can you hear me now? Okay, all right. Try this again. Tables may take up the rest of today's class, or it may not. If it doesn't, we'll roll into our next topic, which is JavaScript. JavaScript we just want to get a taste of in this class. Tables, as we talked about last time, were meant for tables of data. Using tables to achieve a layout is something that we want to avoid. It's generally not good practice. The thought is that really locks you into a particular design, whereas if you keep your HTML honest, that is not putting things in tables that aren't really tables of data, then you have the flexibility to style that any way you want to. Whereas if you format your page using a table for layout purposes only, then you really limit yourself and lock yourself down. Here's the example we looked at last time. And again, this is a good use of it because it is a table of data. All right. By table of data, we mean something that would look like a Excel worksheet. That is rows and columns of data. There's a caption on the table. That's the words my schedule. I formatted the table to be alternating colors through the use of a custom class that I applied to alternating rows. Let's take a look at the code here. Again, simply for simplicity, I put the style sheet code inside the HTML. That's, you know that it's better to have those separate in separate files. We set the width for the table. We set a background color. The caption we styled to be red and text line left. The course we designed to be a little bit different. So all the courses are centered in bold. And we did that not by making them THs, which would be lying about the content, but simply specify, hey, this piece of table data, there's something special about it. It's a course number, and we want to represent our courses some different way. All right. Finally, we created an alt class that we applied to alternating rows, and we achieved the yellow and white barring that helps people be able to view going across. All right. Couple other things associated with tables. These are useful both from an accessibility perspective, and they're also they give you nice little hooks to style stuff with. All right. Remember, we can style things a bunch of different ways. We can style things based on the particular HTML tag. We can style things based on the class. We can style things based on the ID. And we can mix and match a lot of these different things. But if you notice, every row in this table isn't the same, right? It doesn't represent the same sort of thing. Let's put it that way. This row, and in our case it's only one row, but it could potentially be multiple rows of the table. Typically it's only one. But that represents sort of the header section of the table. This set of rows represents the body, and then finally, the last set of rows are sort of like total lines or footers. All right? So we can break this table down into a T-head, T-body, and T-foot section. All right? So I can go in here and say this row is part of the T-head section. And again, there's only one row in the headers. These rows represent the body of the table. And then finally, last but not least, these rows represent the footer. And again, these have accessibility implications, but we'll see in a second how they have styling implications as well. A fundamental rule of design that we've been saying probably since the beginning of class is that like things should look alike, different things should look different. Well, this row is different than these rows, as is this row. So it would make sense to make them look different somehow. All right? Now that we have these defined in T head, T body, and T foot tags, we can create styles for those tags. All right? So for example, I could say the T foot, I want to be a background color of white. Now let's make it totally different. A background color of blue and a text of white. And a font size of 1.2 em. And we'll do text align right for good measure. Now keep in mind that the stuff that I do here, the goofy stuff, I do it just to make sure it's very visible and it's very obvious. I would not suggest that this necessarily is a good design. You know, you can use the kind of color schemes that we talked about earlier in the class and all the principles of web design of not using too many colors and so on and so forth to make it look a lot better and to convey the mood of the page. But the idea here is that visually we want that to stand out because that's a different kind of data than the rest of the stuff. So it makes sense for it to look different as well. So if I go here and look at it now we get that over there. And there's no doubt that that's different. Before I made that change, if you glance at the table, it's possible that it could just all blend it into one undifferentiated body. Whereas if we look at it here, it's clear that that line is different. And then we can do something with the head section as well. We can do something like T head and background gray, color green. All right. And make sure that no one reads the content. Let's make it a lighter gray. So let's do that. Let's make it a darker green. Let's make it lighter still. All right, there we go. We'll stick with that. That actually is green, believe it or not. It might look like it's gray or black, but it is green. We could also make the font bigger or whatever, anything we want to have it stand out. Now, here's an interesting thing. Here's an interesting thought. I'm going to ask a question and see if you can come up with the answer to it. Let's say I want the table to look like this. I want the table to have the headers like this, a border, the body of the table, a border before the footer, and then the footer. So the only two borders I want are after the headers and before the footers. I don't want any borders between the body. How do you suppose I would do that? Well, I want a border. I want a physical line. Margins only is involved with space. Right. Yeah, you put a border. But what? Okay, so let's do this. Where do I put the border? Mm-hmm. Right. You would put a border top in the footer, a border bottom in the header. I probably should have went back and showed more borders before I jumped ahead to this example. All right, we'll kind of rewind and do those first. But the correct answer is that I want to put a border underneath the T head section and a border over top the T foot section. So if I were to just do this, border dotted red 3 pixels, then you'll see that border will go there we go. Oh, tricky. Actually, no, I did not do it. Yeah, let's see. See what's going on with this. So border dotted red 3 pixels. Let's go back. Let's go back to square one and build this. Let's put a border on the whole table. So I'll say border actually I'll put border on the TD and THs. All right, there we go. Now, notice what we have. We have a lot of dots there. All right? And notice also that there's a space in between them. All right? Let's go in and let's try to move this to the T head and the T foot. Okay, I am going to call this a browser bug. Let's scratch that question then. Let's just go back to basic borders. You should be able to do that. Oh, no. We'll do one more take. Should be a TD. This doesn't work, we're giving up. All right. Should be a TH then. There we go. All right, there we go. We have a border on the THs that are in the head section and a border around the TD that is in the foot section. Why is there only one TD in the foot section, by the way? Yeah, I said call span, so I said span 5 columns. Okay, so now this doesn't look the way that I wanted to. All right, I wanted it to be just underneath the header and just above the footer. So what I can do is now I can go in and say border top, border bottom. And now we have that. All right. Now, the one thing that you may notice if you're looking closely is there's a little tiny gap between each of these things. What we can do is we can put in what's called the border collapse attribute. And we simply tell the borders to collapse. And then we eliminate that gap between the things.
Are there other options for word collapse? Or span, something like that?
That's a good question.
It just seems like if we do a line, you know, then there's a left, a right, a center, whatever it could be, and this says border.
Mm-hmm. Collapse, separate, and inherit. Collapse is what we did. Separate is what it was before, because that's the default. And finally, inherit says get your property from the parent element. So if your parent collapsed, you collapse. If your parent was separate, you're separate. All right, let's make this more along the lines of what we want. Let's make it a black line. All right, and there we have that. Now, if I wanted to have a more basic and have it look more like an Excel worksheet kind of thing, I could go in and say, TH, comma, TD. When you have a comma like that, it means both those two things get this style rule. And I could say border solid black 2 pixels. And that kind of looks like shows you the individual cells in the table. So you have a lot of variety as far as this goes. The border is a little bit different than the attributes. I thought that you could put borders on rows, but it doesn't seem to be letting me put borders on rows. Let's try that. No, it did. That's weird. So if you don't want necessarily to show the individual cells, but you want to show the rows, you could go and do something along those lines. think that's it for styling. I'm pausing for a second because I thought there was something else I wanted to talk about as far as styling tables. How come it didn't let me do this then? T foot. It did. I must have had a typo before. I must have did something wrong in those earlier examples, and I don't know. I give up. All right, where were we? We wanted TRs, I think is where we ended up. Now, I'm going to go and I'm going to make a mistake in my CSS code. I'm going to turn the screen off for a second. And I'm going to go into my CSS code and I'm going to make a mistake.
I know how to do that.
Just in case you don't. Okay. Here's the table. All right. Doesn't look the way that it used to. So obviously I made some kind of mistake. You know, let's say I wanted to just change one little thing and all of a sudden it looks like this. How would you go about debugging this? Because we have some clues and we have some tools at our disposal. What's one of the tools that we have at our disposal? The validator. All right. So I'm going to kind of show you two ways that we could approach solving this problem. One way is we have the validator. So I could go and go into the validator for CSS, paste my code in there, check, and we found an error. Now, I sure wish that the error would come out and say something like, hey, you forgot a curly bracket, but it doesn't. But it points you in a direction of where the error is. And if we look, what we see is it gives me this line as being the error. Yeah, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's that line. It could be something before it. So in this case, what I did is I omitted the curly bracket. All right. So when you get that error, you can pretty safely assume the problem isn't down there, right? So I can look here and up, and again, that cuts down your chances of a problem, and you can find it. Yes?
Does it stop checking and or does it continue to check?
Well, that's a good question. It appears like it continues to check because it told me that that is okay. Let's play validator or browser and kind of think of what's going on here. It sees this CSS rule for a course, a class name course. It sees the start of the curly bracket. It then does not see the ending curly bracket, so it assumes all this stuff is part of the style rule. And that obviously doesn't make sense as part of the style rule, so that's where it throws up its arms and gives up. Now the validator looks like it says, okay, that's bad, but I'm going to validate the stuff after it. The browser, it does something a little bit different. It gets to this point, it can't parse through that, it throws its hands up and says, I'm not going to apply any more styles. So that brings us to point number 2 of how to debug this. We could look to see where the style starts to break down. In other words, in this case, All right, the table is yellow. That means that this style rule worked. The caption is red and right aligned. That means this style worked. The course is it centered and font way to bold? Yes, it is. Are alternate rows white? No. So that kind of gives us the same information that did. That, hey, that course part kind of worked, but immediately after it stopped working, so maybe there's something wrong with the course. The other thing that you can do, and I do this frequently, because sometimes, through your best efforts, even by doing this, you might find that there's no error per se in your CSS. All right, so the validator doesn't find anything, but it still doesn't look the way that you want it to, right? Just like a paper in English might not have any grammar errors in it, but it might not convey your ideas correctly. All right, so you have to go back and debug that. That's a little bit different kind of debugging. All right, and in traditional programming, they would call that the difference between like a logic error and a syntax error. Syntax error simply means you broke the rules of the language. You spelled a word wrong. You forgot a period at the end of a sentence. All those sort of things. Those, believe it or not, are actually kind of the good errors to get, right? Because those errors, someone can tell you got those errors, whether it be a second set of eyes or the validator or whatever. It can show you, hey, I don't know what to do with this code. All right? And you can see the effect that it says, hey, this is working, this isn't, so the problem must be in this area. A logic error is where the page doesn't look the way that you wanted it to. All right? It's kind of hard to make one of these up, but one thing that you can do is, what I do typically, if I run into something where my style just doesn't look like I want it to, I'll go and I will cut the entire style out. And display it without any style. Okay, there's my table. The syntax of my table is correct. That's the way an unstyled table should look. All right? Then I'll go back and I'll add stuff back in. So I'll say, okay, let me add the table tag back in, the style rule for that. Okay, there it did that. And I'll gradually add things in one piece at a time. All right? I'll make a copy, I'll save, I'll make a second copy of the CSS file or whatever, and I'll slowly eliminate things and then add things back in. That's very useful, like if you're getting extra spaces that you're not really sure where it goes to, and so on. Another thing that is good that I often do is if I'm having a little bit of trouble with spacing of elements, I'll go in and I'll put a margin and padding of 0 for everything, and then slowly add the margins and padding back in. Like if there's too big of a gap between two things and I can't really identify like what's causing that gap, why is there that extra space, I'll go in and I'll put in a margin and padding of 0 pixels, and then I'll gradually, again, add the margin and padding back in until I get what I have. Now you may find tricks that work for you. These are my debugging tricks. The important thing, though, in my mind, is to take a systematic approach, to take some sort of systematic approach. In other words, what I see too many students doing, and everyone does this. I'm not claiming innocence here, but like, I'll just take a stab. What if I change that to 150, and boom, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, The point is that's sort of like solving the algebra problem just by like guessing numbers. A train leaves Chicago going 70 miles an hour, one leaves from Cleveland. They'll hit in Toledo, right? Or let's plug in 100 miles. You can come up with the answer, but you're not really learning a systematic way of approaching it, which means that as you get harder and harder questions, it'll be harder and harder to do. You know, there's some people that are good at mental math that, like, they do the algebra so intuitively in their head that they don't even think of the steps. They can just, like, give you the answer for that. And that's good, except when the problems get really complicated. All right? And it's sort of the same thing with this. You know, if you take the hit and miss approach in trying to debug your code, maybe for simpler examples you'll be able to get lucky and nail it fairly quickly. But when you get into more complicated examples, it's good to have sort of that process to go through. And that's largely individual. You know, people will come up with that. My suggestion is you develop some sort of process and work through it. And those are the suggestions that work for me. All right? Getting rid of all the paddings and margins is one thing I do. Getting rid of all the CSS code and slowly adding it back in. That's another thing I do. See where the CSS code breaks. That's another thing I do. Run it through a validator. All those things are sort of used for different problems, right? Because if there's actually a syntax error, actually you can see things stop working. If there is no syntax error, it's doing what it thinks it should be doing, but either there's a bug in the browser or there's a bug in your code. So it's important to sort of have these tools, these systematic tools to approach. The other big thing, and I've suggested this a number of times, is to go and change your colors to something that's going to be obvious. Like if I'm not sure the way something is, I'll go and make, I'll go and make something an outrageous color just so that it stands out, so I can see how that works. Because a lot of times, especially when you get to layout and spacing issues, you'll see that there's a gap that you don't want, but where is that gap really? What is that gap really part of? Well, if you have a couple of things the same color, it might not be obvious what that gap's part of, but if you go in and change some colors for that, it makes it a lot more obvious to see. All right. The last thing I want to talk about is accessibility for tables. Let's go and let's put this back to the way it was. All right. If I were to ask you, what does this represent? BU215. You wouldn't even have to think about it. Your eyes would simply go across and say, that is the room that CISS 216 meets in. All right? You sort of know how these things work. You know how this table of data works. And the way it's designed, and we can do things CSS-wise to make it easier, like alternating the rows and putting borders and that sort of thing. But your eye automatically goes up and across to find out that and that. Typically, like the first column of a table is like something special. It sort of like identifies a row. And the first row identifies the column. So you could think of this as being sort of like a header for the row, and this being the header for the columns. All right? And as I said, people that can see just do it automatically. They see how they connect and so on. Now, people that aren't able to see, we need to supply them a mechanism where their accessibility tools and their assistive technology can do the same thing. And that's accomplished through the use of headers and IDs. Now, this is something that is pretty straightforward, but it does seem to confuse people. So I'll go over it and we'll talk about it for a bit. What I'm going to do to start with is I'm going to put an ID on each of the things that is considered a table row. I'm going to get rid of some of these extra table rows. All right. So I'm going to put an ID on the first column of every table, of every row, and the first row of the table. So I'm going to say ID equals CISS 216. As an ID, it's going to uniquely identify the row. So in other words, this row, what is this row about? I'm identifying as being CISS 216. And I'm going to do the same thing with the columns. Now, all the things that I've identified as being like headers here, descriptions of the rows and columns, in other words, the first column and the first row, I've given an ID to each of those elements. What I need to do now is associate all the table data cells with those. And how do I do that? I use a headers tag, or headers attribute. So this one I'd say headers equals, and I'll put number. What does that mean? Well, it means that the column header for this cell has an ID of number. So that points this cell to this header, which is the course number. Now the TD for web development, the headers of this cell equal name, space, and CISS 216. So effectively what this is doing is this is putting the IDs up and down just like you'd visually see. In other words, if I saw web development, what is web development? Well, I can get the header for it in the ID of name, and I can get the row header for it in the CISS 216 column. And I just go right down the line for each of these. Oops. This would be day then. This would be room. And this would be instructor. Now, let me go in. Just so I don't have to retype a lot of this. Now I can almost see what you're thinking. Wow, this is a lot of work. Am I right? Well, there's two answers that I have for it. Actually, there's three answers, depending on who asks the question. If, say, my kid asked the question and said this is too much work, I'd give them stories about how back when I was in high school, when we did web development, we didn't even have computers to test it on. So this is actually pretty simple because at least you have a computer to run it on and go on and on, something along those lines. Hard work never killed anyone, one of those kind of lectures. The other two answers are, number one, this is a lot of work if you go back after the fact and do it. If you did this, if you built this table from the ground up with this in here, it'd be less work. Or it wouldn't be as difficult. What made it difficult is the fact that I first did it without and then went back and added it in. It's kind of like, if they were to build, say, a building with paying no attention to accessibility for people with wheelchairs and so on, and then they had to come back later and retrofit the building. That would be a lot of work, and that would be a lot of cost. All right? To be sure, there's additional cost for putting those features in the building initially. But that extra cost is small compared to going back and retrofitting it. It's the same old thing over and over again. The graph that I think I showed in this class, I show in all my classes, the mapping of the cost of a software development change versus the phase at which you change it. If you change something or you put something in early on, it doesn't cost that much, or it doesn't cost as much. The further along down the process you go, the cost gets increasingly higher. It increases actually at an increasing rate, which means that once the system is built and in place, to go back and do something is way more expensive than if you would have just thought about it then. So again, for some of these accessibility things, the key is to build them in from the start as opposed to developing your site and then baking them in later. The third component of this answer, beyond hard work never killed anyone, and it's not quite that bad if you do it from the start, the third part of this answer is very likely big tables are going to be generated through server-side scripts. So they're going to be written by a program anyhow. So in that regard, it doesn't take you any more time to put in these header attributes for a table with one row than it would for a table with 1,000 rows. Because you're not going to put in the individual IDs and all that. You're going to put in code that's going to generate those IDs and headers. Which, again, for those of you that haven't done any programming, that might be a little fuzzy. But trust me, it's a lot easier to do that than to individually go in and put the IDs on 100 different rows. All right? So this is tables in a nutshell. All right? I didn't cover all of the styling aspects of tables, but again, keep in mind that the nice thing about CSS is that to a large degree, what you can do in one element to style it, you can do with others. All right? It's not a universal truth, but that's sort of the default position. In other words, could I change the font family of the footer section? Yeah, sure, why not? And we didn't show that example, but that doesn't mean you can't do it, because you can go and extend the examples we've done previously to do a lot of different things. Any questions at this point?
Oh, let's throw the code back out there, please.
Yeah. Yeah. Let's look at this BU105. If I have to find out what BU 105 is, what this is saying is, I get part of the answer is in the cell with an ID of room. All right, and what does that cell say? It says room. All right. The other part of the answer is to be found in the cell that has the ID of CISS 216. If this will help, it doesn't have to match the text of the cell. It just has to match the ID of the cell. So in this case, maybe the example made it a little fuzzy because the value of the cell was the same as the ID I put on it, but it just has to match the ID. So, if this said room on LCCC campus, course number per catalog, or whatever, all you have to do is point to the ID. And that's what is important to it. Other questions? How's the project going?
Hoping it rains like crazy this weekend.
You're hoping it rains like crazy this weekend. Okay. I hope you're wrong, but... Questions? All right. What we will do Thursday and probably next week, although I would maybe like to squeeze in maybe a partial work/showcase day for your projects, one of those days, or maybe part of a class. But we'll talk about JavaScript. And again, we'll talk about JavaScript more to give you a sense of like what it brings to the table, like why it's important. What does it do that the other two tools don't do? And we'll see some very simple, straightforward examples. I don't think you're required to do any JavaScript for any of your assignments, but I think I made it an option. If you want to, for fun, throw in some JavaScript, then I'm certainly not going to be the person to tell you no. All right, we'll see you over in lab.